Okay, so private landowners and developers. So you saw the Simpsons video where he couldn't do anything once they found this endangered bug on their property. So this is Section 9 of the Endangered Species Act that says it's unlawful to do a taking on private lands. Right? So if you own a piece of property and there's a habitat or an endangered species that your property is a critical habitat for it, you can't like mess up their critical habitat. So it's pretty bad. It's kind of, as we talked about in the first section, that it is a burden on the landowner. Other prohibitions. There's a bunch. If you look at page 311 to 312, you can't move them, export them, offer for sale or sell them. And this also applies to, say you have like what do you call it? A dead animal that you have stuffed or something like that, or parts of an animal and seeds too. And then on page, I think it's actually 312, there are exemptions to it. So so takings are bad on private land. Now, there are joint efforts that you might be able to get a permit, as a way to kind of get through some of the big obligations under ESA. So your local government, you can create habitat conservation plans, right? You're trying to save this wetland, and then through that, you might be able to get one of those incidental take permits. There, an example is Natural Community Conservation Planning Program that helps preserve this California scrub habitat. Just think of like our prairie grass kind of things. There's also safe harbor programs. So if a developer might come up with a way to develop their lands in ways more sensitive and attract endangered species, so then they, to allow them to develop properties. So I don't know if you have things with big cliffs for eagles or whatever, or wetlands for a lot of the wetland species are on a list, and they call those safe harbor agreements. And if there's some sort of potential taking, they would apply for what we call an enhancement of survival permit. And then there's exceptions for maybe scientific research, okay, under a recovery and interstate commerce permit. So if you're trying to study a species, or even like figure out how many there are left, you might be doing things like surveillance or tagging, and monitoring them. So that is a different way to comply with the ESA and still study these species. Well, these aren't protected, but we do worry about our ecosystem, some of these invasive species that come, just basically they don't belong here, but because of commerce they've gotten here. Like, it's not an Asian carp, it's the Asian carp, right, that are in a lot of our lakes and waterways that are huge. That the beetle that killed a bunch of a bunch of our trees, probably 5-10 years back. Some plants, um, other kinds of things. There is a international treaty called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Sites or cities. I don't know. Sometimes they call it CITES. Sometimes it's CITIES. And this convention bans trade in endangered species, live or dead. So, like, if you're trying to get an elephant tusk or a rhino horn or something like that, that is banned by the CITES treaty. and limits trade in other species that maybe aren't threatened, but maybe we shouldn't be doing that either. And if it's a licensing system, so unless you're licensed, you can't trade in these species. But it is tough to enforce, and sometimes they have like undercover enforcement to stop poachers and people from trading in things like rhino horn or ivory or things like that. So that's a pretty cool treaty. Native American tribes, they don't recognize the ESA as applying to them because their land, they think of themselves as a sovereign state. So they don't maybe necessarily like it. They, in their tribal headdresses, as a kind of like a religious ceremony, they use eagle feathers, even though the CFR requires a permit for that. There are treaties from when the reservation system was established after, the conflicts with the natives, where they, granted them unlimited use of like, fishing and maybe hunting rights. So, sometimes that might conflict with the taking prohibitions. So in 1997, there was a joint secretarial order between the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Interior, which orders the National Marine Fish Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service. They have to work to harmonize both the tribal rights with the Endangered Species Act, and they are required to consult with the tribes and notify them, and some specific there's a bunch of specific requirements here, which you can see on page 318 of the textbook if you want more information about that. Where's the head of Kate? Where's that? I wonder where I put this. Did I delete that whole thing? I bet you I did. Well, there's another case that I had a slide for, which is on page 307, called Kontoski. Maybe no. Maybe I'll put it back here under the Eagles. Do I put under the Eagles? I do. Okay, never mind. I don't have to talk about that this minute. Did that. Sorry. Okay, so federal lands, because we're talking about stuff that are done on federal lands. So federal land is public land in the public domain, right? That's not privately owned. If we have general public land, there's different agencies that manage them. That's the Bureau of Land Management. National Forest is the Forestry Service. Wildlife refuges are the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then national parks is managed by the National Parks and Service. So it's all federal land, but like different agencies manage different categories of federal land. The Bureau of Land Management and the Forestry Service, they manage that land for multiple uses. So might be fishing licenses, mining, logging, grazing land for cows and cattle and sheep. So that category of land, there can be multiple uses, but these national wildlife refuges, the requirement is that the use of the land has to be conservation of wildlife, and other uses allowed, would only be anything compatible with the goal. So you look back there, right? So that's the Fish and Wildlife Service, kind of coinkydink or not coinkydink, that Fish and Wildlife Services is also in charge of administering the Endangered Species Act. Okay, so these national parks and wilderness areas, we don't have that, ability to do mining and logging licenses. So we really have to preserve this natural condition, back to the John Muir kind of things, where it's, hiking and camping, and not, and not like just lands that can be used for commercial purposes. There's a bunch of laws about the use of government lands, and you know, sometimes it's a big to do over licenses being granted for certain purposes. In 1964, LBJ signed the National Wilderness Preservation System, which is a higher standard than the any of these other classifications of federal land, where you really can't do anything in these, like kind of like you can't have camping permits. Like anybody, if you go in, it's leave no trace. It's all like wilderness, were are there. And then whoever it's managed by, it just depends on where that land ended up, where it is, these existing wilderness areas. There is an Illinois National Wilderness Area. You can go to that link on your own, down close to the Kentucky border. It's actually, my husband and I went there during COVID because we were looking for like some outdoor activities, and it was beautiful. We just did in and out hiking in a day. So I would recommend that. Bit of a hike, bit of a drive to get there. All right, so let's stop this part. I think this is, and then you're going to work on the written assignment in your module, which is assignment 12.2 on page 313 on the bottom, number 3, all the questions to that. Okay, and then we'll come back.